I'm Faye, and I was 33 the night my father forced my grandfather out into a storm. It was a Tuesday in March, the kind of West Texas rain that blows sideways and refuses to stop. My phone buzzed once. It was a neighbor I barely knew. "Your granddad is sitting on the porch in this weather," she wrote, bags and all. I was 40 minutes away. I made it in 30. 8 months earlier, my grandfather had sold his ranch for $1.2 million and given every dollar to my father. In return, he asked for only one thing. 3 simple words: take care of me. What the reading of his will revealed 3 months later, after he was gone, after an attorney opened a folder none of us knew existed, is the part nobody in that room expected, including me. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, quiet stories about family, money, and the people who eventually stop apologizing. If you've ever heard a story that left you sitting silently in your parked car, you're in the right place. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, that night, when I helped him into my truck, he was holding one thing tightly against his chest: an old weather radio. But to explain that, I need to go back 8 months, because the money came first, and the money explains everything. My grandfather, Harold Anderson, was 80 years old when he sold the ranch. He had worked that land for 51 years. When an offer came in, $1.2 million for the surface rights, clean and simple, he accepted it. Then he did something I still struggle to understand. He gave every cent to my father. No trust, no written conditions, no legal agreement. On a Friday afternoon, he wired the entire amount into Roy Anderson's checking account. I was there that day, sitting at my parents' bow kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold. My father kept repeating the same thing. "Dad, you don't have to do this." And my grandfather, who never wasted words, looked across the table and answered plainly, "Take care of me." That was the arrangement. A handshake and 3 words. My mother, Linda, sat with her arms crossed the entire time, nodding as though she had personally negotiated the deal. I remember thinking it was strange that a man as careful as Harold would hand over everything based on a promise. So I asked him, "Grandpa, why didn't you put it in writing?" He smiled at me, the slow smile he used when he thought you were almost asking the right question. "Some things you write down, Faye," he said. "Some things you find out." At the time, I thought it was just old man wisdom. The kind of phrase that sounds meaningful because someone old says it. I assumed he simply didn't want to deal with lawyers. About them, about that, and about nearly everything else that year. He folded his hands over the weather radio, sitting on the table, and said nothing more. The transfer cleared on Monday. You need to understand who Harold Anderson was, or the rest of this story won't make sense. He was the richest poor man in Texas. He repaired his work boots until there was more glue than leather left. He drank coffee from the same chipped blue enamel mug for as long as I could remember, and washed it by hand every single day. When the air conditioner in his truck died, he drove with the windows down for 3 summers rather than pay for repairs. We all believed the ranch was everything he owned. That $1.2 million looked like Harold's entire life converted into cash. He never corrected us, but every now and then he would say something that didn't fit the image we had of him. The day after the money transfer cleared, I drove him back to the empty ranch so he could walk the fence line one final time. He stopped at the cattle gate and stared out across the flat brown land. "People think it's just dirt," he said. "The land was never just dirt." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a small brass key hanging from a worn leather cord beneath his shirt and rolled it between his fingers. I was 33 and trying to recover from failure. The startup I had spent 4 years building, a soil sensor company, had collapsed earlier that year. I was doing contract coding from a small apartment and pretending I still had a plan. So when Grandpa started talking about dirt that wasn't really dirt, I only half listened, the way you do when your own problems feel bigger than everything else. He slipped the key back under his collar. We drove home with the windows down and the heat filling the truck. That brass key became a running mystery between us. He wore it everywhere, even at the dinner table. One day I asked directly what it opened. He pinched the key through his shirt and grinned. "A key still opens something worth opening," he said. "That's all I'll tell a girl who lost an entire company. From anyone else, it would have hurt. From him, it felt almost gentle. Harold's version of encouragement. His way of telling me he still believed in me, even when I didn't. That same week, he moved into my parents' house in town. Roy gave him the back bedroom that used to belong to my brother Dale. For about a month, everything looked normal from the outside. Then the phone calls started. My mother would call me with carefully arranged concern in her voice. "Faye, has your grandfather said anything to you about us? About the house?" I would tell her no, because he hadn't. She would pause a little too long. Then she would say, "Well, he gets confused. We just want to handle things properly." At the time, I didn't have a name for what was happening. Now I do. It was a classic step in elder financial abuse. Keep the money discussions isolated. Keep the responsible family members uninformed. Call it management. My mother was good at that. She had grown up with very little and married into a family that owned land but never lived lavishly. For 30 years, she felt like wealth was always nearby, but never truly hers. When $1.2 million arrived, something inside her decided it was finally owed. I didn't recognize the danger in those conversations. I thought my parents were exhausted. I thought caring for an elderly parent was difficult. I told myself that for weeks. Right up until the night the bags appeared on the porch in the rain. So now we're back to that Tuesday in March. The storm. The neighbor's message. I ended a video call mid-sentence, grabbed my keys, and drove toward my parents' house while the windshield wipers fought a losing battle. When I arrived, my grandfather was sitting beneath the porch light, 2 canvas bags beside him, already soaked through. The weather radio was pressed against his chest like a child holding a favorite toy. The antenna was raised. The speaker crackled with storm warnings nobody needed because the storm was already there. The porch light was on. The house lights were off. They had put him outside and gone to bed. I walked up the path. Before I could knock, my father opened the door. It looked as though he had been waiting. "Faye, it's not what it looks like," he said. "There's a waiting list at Sage Meadows. My mother appeared behind him in her robe. "We put him by the curb so the transport van could find him easily," she said. "In the morning?" I asked. "In a thunderstorm? At 10 o'clock at night?" I asked how long he had been sitting outside. Roy looked at the floor. Linda lifted her chin. "He's not our responsibility anymore," she said. "We did our part." "There is no transport van," I replied. "There is no Sage Meadows. There's only an 80-year-old man sitting in the rain." Nobody answered. So I stopped talking. I walked back down the steps. I knelt in front of my grandfather and placed my hand on the cold weather radio. "Hey," I said, "let's get you out of here." He looked at me. For a man my mother claimed was confused, his eyes were perfectly clear. "Take care of me," he said quietly, not as a plea, more like he was passing something into my hands. I picked up his bags, helped him into the truck, and as I fastened his seatbelt, the porch light behind us went dark. We drove away from that house with the radio crackling softly between us. I sat there staring at the line of light beneath his door, listening to him sleep. I found it while organizing his medications. He had asked me to refill his pill organizer from the bottles he kept in the nightstand drawer. When I pulled the bag out, something slipped free and landed on the floor. A sealed envelope, heavy cream-colored paper, the kind people use for important things. Attached to the front with a paper clip was a printed appointment card. The envelope had a name embossed in the corner: Margaret Ellison, attorney at law, estate and trust. The appointment card listed a date and time, 11 days away. Beneath it was a handwritten note in writing that wasn't my grandfather's. "Bring the key." I sat back on my heels holding it, and I didn't open it. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it many times since. A man had handed over $1.2 million. He had been left outside in the rain, and his exhausted, broke granddaughter discovered a sealed envelope from an estate attorney in his nightstand. Still, I didn't open it. It never even tempted me. Some doors belong to the person who owns them. I clipped the appointment card back onto the envelope and returned everything exactly where I found it. When I went to put the medication bag away, I noticed him watching me from the bed. He had been awake the entire time. He looked at the drawer, then at me. Then his hand moved to his collar and closed around the brass key hanging from the leather cord. Like someone holding on to something he was finally ready to use. "You'll drive me Thursday," he said. It wasn't a question. I told him I would. I didn't ask about the envelope. I didn't ask what the key unlocked. I simply memorized the details. The 11th day, 11 a.m., Margaret Ellison, and I carried that information in the back of my mind through everything that followed. On Thursday, I drove him into town to a low-brick office building with Margaret Ellison's name displayed on a brass plaque beside the entrance. He had dressed carefully for the visit. Pressed shirt, good boots. The patched work boots stayed home. Before we went inside, he removed the brass key from around his neck and held it tightly in his fist. I offered to return later and pick him up. "Sit," he said. So I sat. 53 minutes. A styrofoam cup of terrible coffee. A quiet waiting room. When the office door finally opened, he came out looking steadier than when he had entered, like a man who had finally set down a burden he'd carried for years. The attorney walked him out. Margaret Ellison, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed into iron gray hair, a firm handshake, the kind that felt genuine. She looked at me for a moment longer than a stranger normally would. Then she asked if I was Faye. Not guessed. Asked. I said yes. She nodded once, as if that confirmed something important. Then she told my grandfather she would take care of the rest. Back in the truck, he buckled his seatbelt and stared through the windshield for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I fixed something I should have fixed years ago." I asked what he meant. He rolled the brass key between his fingers and slipped it back under his collar. "You'll find out," he said. The same answer as always. "You'll find out." That was Harold's entire philosophy condensed into 3 words. I started the truck. I wanted to ask questions about the envelope, the key, what he had fixed, why now, but his eyes were closed. His face rested in the sunlight coming through the glass, and for the first time in months, he looked completely at peace. So I let the silence stay and drove us home. Dale showed up the following weekend. My brother was 38 and struggling. A failed house flip in Odessa. A second mortgage. A permanent tone that sounded halfway between conversation and a request for money. He arrived carrying a gas station bouquet, a smile, and the transparent intentions of a man who had already done the math on an elderly relative. He spent about 10 minutes with Grandpa, mostly talking about himself. Then he found me in the kitchen. "So how's he doing?" "Really?" Dale asked, and I knew he meant financially. I answered honestly, "He's tired." Dale lowered his voice. "Somebody should probably have power of attorney for his protection. Family should handle it. Me, Mom, Dad, keep it simple." I told him Grandpa was managing his own affairs just fine. Dale's smile tightened. "Faye, there's stuff you don't know about. He has assets nobody's tracking. If something happens and it isn't sorted out, it'll be a mess for everybody." "What assets?" I asked. He immediately looked like he had said too much. Then he waved it away. "The ranch money. Mom and Dad's money." But that wasn't what had caught my attention. Assets. Plural. As though there was more than the $1.2 million. I stored that information beside the other unanswered questions I was already carrying. After Dale left, I checked on Grandpa. The apartment walls were thin. He had heard every word. "Your brother wants my signature," he said. I told him nobody would get his signature unless he wanted them to. He laughed quietly. "Oh, they'll get a signature," he said. "Just not the one they're after." I asked what that meant. Instead of answering, he patted the weather radio sitting on the nightstand. "Turn that up, would you?" he said. "There's weather coming." And there was. 3 days out on the long-range forecast, the first spring storms moving north from the Gulf. Although by the time they arrived, everything had already changed. The last truly good evening we had together was a Sunday. He felt stronger. He ate a full dinner. He sat at the kitchen table while I soldered a new probe lead. The weather radio played a baseball game quietly in the background. He watched me work for a while. Then he spoke. "The thing I've carried around all this time," he said. "You never once asked what was in it for you." I looked up. He was slowly turning his mug on the tabletop. "Your parents, the day I wired the money, your brother last weekend, their first question was always the same. What's in it for me? You've taken care of me for 3 months. You sold your car. You never asked once." I told him there was nothing to ask. He shook his head slowly. "That's the whole point, Faye. That's the entire point." I didn't know how to respond, so I told him the truth. A simple truth. "I didn't take you in because of a reason. I took you in because you're my grandfather. He sat quietly for a long moment. Then he turned his own 3 words back toward me. You did take care of me. Past tense. As though he was closing the final chapter of a book. I joked that the job wasn't finished yet, told him to eat his vegetables. He smiled and let it pass. But something had settled inside him. A calmness I mistook for peace. Only later did I understand it was acceptance. He went to bed early. I tucked the blanket around him and turned the radio down, not off, exactly the way he liked it. As I reached the doorway, he spoke. Good night, kid. Good night, Grandpa. Those were the last ordinary words we ever shared. I didn't know that. He may have. I'm going to tell you what the lawyer eventually read aloud, and I promise it's worth the wait. But first, if you have an aging parent or grandparent, and your care arrangement exists only as a verbal agreement, consider this your reminder. A handshake is not a plan. A cleared check is not a contract. Leave a comment saying noted if you needed that reminder today. And subscribe, because this is where the story changes. He never woke up on Wednesday morning. I knew before I opened the bedroom door. The same way you know a house is empty the moment you walk inside. He passed peacefully in his sleep sometime during the early hours. The weather radio still murmured from the nightstand. The chipped blue mug sat upside down on the drying rack where he had left it. He had washed it before bed. 80 years old. 3 months removed from sitting on a porch in a thunderstorm. And the last thing he did was rinse his own cup so I wouldn't have to. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The radio continued talking. A calm voice, reading a marine forecast for a coastline hundreds of miles away, for boats neither of us would ever own. Eventually, I reached over and turned it off. The apartment became unbearably quiet, so I turned it back on. Then I handled the practical things. I called the doctor, I called the funeral home, and because they were still his family, and because decency shouldn't depend on whether someone deserves it, I called my parents. My mother answered. Mom, I said, Grandpa passed away last night. There was silence. Then came the words I will remember for the rest of my life. Not grief, not sadness. A question, quick and eager. Oh, Faye, she said. Has anyone called the lawyer? Her father had been gone only a few hours, and her first thought was the estate. I told her I had to go and ended the call. The radio crackled softly nearby. I poured coffee into Grandpa's mug. Then I let it go cold, just to understand what that felt like. The funeral was where my mother delivered the performance of her life. She wore charcoal gray. She cried at exactly the right moments. She accepted sympathy from every cousin who approached. We took such good care of him, she repeated again and again. We did everything we could. At the end, he just wanted to be with family. People nodded. People comforted her. People believed her. Across the room, Aunt Carol gave me a look that seemed to say, "See? She's devastated. How could you think otherwise?" I stood quietly in a black dress I had originally purchased for a startup presentation that never happened, and I said nothing. Because there is no winning an argument about grief against someone willing to cry over what they caused. Dale delivered a eulogy about hard work that somehow became mostly about Dale. My father never spoke. Roy sat in the front pew with his hands between his knees and his eyes fixed on the floor. Twice I noticed him glance toward the casket before looking away quickly. That was the first crack I saw in him. I remembered it. After the service, as people slowly left, a woman with iron gray hair walked toward me carrying a leather folder. Margaret Ellison. She offered sincere condolences, then handed me a card. A date and time were written on the back. The reading of the will, she said. 10 days from now, my office. Then she held my gaze. Your grandfather requested that everyone be present. Everyone. After that, she did something strange. She glanced once toward my mother, looked back at me, and gave a small nod. The kind of nod that says, I know something you don't know yet. The 10 days leading up to the reading felt like their own storm. My mother's version of events hardened into family history. Faye manipulated a confused old man. Faye isolated him from his loving son. Faye wants the estate. The irony of hearing that last accusation from the woman whose first question after her father's death was about the lawyer could have powered a small city. Relatives chose sides. Aunt Carol called and gently suggested that maybe I should allow the family to handle the will and avoid making a scene. A scene. I had spent 3 months making dinners, losing contracts, selling my car, and caring for an old man. My mother cried in a chapel, and somehow that counted as grief. I didn't argue. Not because I was saintly. I wanted to scream the truth. But I had spent 8 months watching the loudest voice win every discussion. I decided not to fight on that field. Let them talk. Talk wasn't the trial. Talk was just talk. I'm not going to argue about a man I actually showed up for, I told Carol. Then I ended the call. Back in the quiet apartment, I kept Grandpa's weather radio running. I left his mug on the windowsill, and I kept the brass key. 3 days after the funeral, while sorting through the last of his belongings, I found it. Not around his neck. Not on the leather cord where it had lived for months. It was sitting loose in the nightstand drawer. Underneath it was a folded note written in his blocky pencil handwriting. Give this to Margaret. That was all it said. So I planned to. 10 days felt like a year. The storm we had been tracking kept building. The morning of the will reading, I did something that probably sounds strange. I placed his weather radio in the passenger seat of my truck and buckled it in. I know how that sounds. I'm an engineer. I don't believe radios carry souls, but I had already driven him to the lawyer's office once with that radio crackling between us, and I wasn't going to make the final drive alone, so the radio rode shotgun, its antenna raised, a severe thunderstorm watch playing through the speaker. The storm we had been hearing about for days was finally arriving. The brass key sat in my coat pocket, wrapped in Grandpa's note. For 10 days, I had wondered what it opened. A safe, a locker, a drawer, something hidden, something important. I parked outside Margaret Ellison's brick office just as the first heavy raindrops struck the windshield. My parents' Buick was already there. So was Dale's truck. The truck he couldn't really afford. I sat for a moment with my hand resting on the radio's warm plastic case. Whatever happens in there, I said quietly, we did our part. Then I switched it off. The cab fell silent. I picked up the key and the note, and I walked inside to learn what my grandfather had spent his final clear afternoon putting into writing. The waiting room smelled faintly of rain and copier toner. My mother sat there with her ankles crossed, her chin raised, already wearing My mother sat there with the expression of a woman expecting to be proven right. Dale bounced his knee impatiently. My father sat slightly apart from everyone else, staring down at the carpet. When I walked in, he looked up briefly. The expression on his face was hard to read. Part guilt, part fear, part apology. Then he looked away. While we waited, my mother did what she always did. She spoke. Leaning toward my father, she made sure her voice carried across the room. Well, there's probably not much to read anyway, she said. He already gave everything to us. She emphasized the word us like a flag planted in the ground. Dale laughed softly. Probably just the truck in that old radio, he said, glancing at me after seeing me carry it inside. You need to understand what they believed walking into that room because it matters. They believed the $1.2 million was everything Harold Anderson owned. They believed the money was theirs permanently. They believed the arrangement was complete. To them, this was simply a formality, a short will, a few personal belongings, a dead rancher's leftovers, and maybe an argument over who got the mug or the weather radio. They had no idea, not one of them. For 30 years, they had been standing on top of something valuable while insisting it was only dirt. The inner office door opened. Margaret Ellison stood there holding a leather folder. She looked at each person in the room. Her gaze stopped on me last. Harold updated everything 8 weeks ago, she said. The room went silent. 8 weeks. My mother's smile faltered. 8 weeks ago meant after the porch, after the rain, after he moved into my tiny apartment, after he started helping me redesign sensors and asking who kept things in writing. Updated everything. Margaret stepped aside and held the door open. Please come in, she said. He specifically requested that I read this with all of you present. He was very clear about that. We followed her inside. Rain struck the windows in steady sheets. The conference room was small, one long table, 8 chairs, a rain-covered window, a metal cabinet against the wall. My Aunt Carol and one of my cousins were already there. Margaret had apparently asked them to attend as witnesses. My parents sat together on one side, Dale beside them. I sat across from them. The relatives took seats at the end. Margaret sat at the head of the table and placed the leather folder in front of her. Then she set down something else, a long gray metal lockbox drawer, the kind used in filing cabinets. It had a small keyhole. Immediately, I felt the brass key in my pocket. Suddenly, it seemed heavier. Before opening the documents, Margaret spoke. "Your grandfather left instructions." She slid a folded note toward me. I opened it. The familiar blocky pencil handwriting was unmistakable. "Faye, open it when she asks. The key is yours." I stood, walked to the cabinet, and with every eye in the room watching me, I removed the brass key from its worn leather cord. I inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting decades. Inside was a single accordion file, thick, heavy, labeled in my grandfather's handwriting. The land. I carried it back to the table and placed it in front of Margaret. My mother's voice sounded thinner than before. "What is that?" Margaret opened the file, put on her reading glasses, looked around the room, then spoke. "This," she said, "is what Harold Anderson actually owned." The atmosphere changed before she even read a number. Margaret spoke plainly. No theatrics, which somehow made it hit harder. In 1979, she began, "Harold Anderson separated the mineral estate from the surface rights of his ranch and signed a mineral lease that most people in the county believed was worthless. It was not worthless. For 46 years, those mineral rights generated income, slowly at first, then steadily. Later, when additional wells were developed in the basin, the value increased significantly." She paused. "Harold never spent that money." The room remained silent. "He allowed it to accumulate in accounts and conservative investments that he managed personally. He told no one. He patched his boots. He drove without air conditioning. He lived exactly as he always had. When he sold the ranch last year, he sold only the surface. He kept what was underneath." Margaret turned a statement around so everyone could see it. "At the time of his update 8 weeks ago, the mineral estate and accumulated proceeds were valued at slightly more than $20 million. $20 million. The number sat in the middle of the table. Dale made a choking sound. My mother stared. "That's impossible." The confidence had vanished from her voice. Carol covered her mouth, but my father never looked at the statement. Not once. He was staring at the accordion file, at the words "the land" written in his father's handwriting. His face had gone pale. The land was never just dirt. I heard my grandfather's voice clearly in my head. He had told me twice, once by the fence, once after our prototype worked, and both times I had only half listened. My mother recovered first. "Fine," she said, gripping the edge of the table. "Fine, but we already have the $1.2 million. That was Harold's gift to Roy. That's settled." Margaret waited for her to finish. Then she removed another document from the file and placed it on the table. "About that," she said, "Harold addressed the transfer directly in his estate plan." She looked down at the page. "He did not classify the money as a gift. He did not classify it as payment for care because no caregiver agreement was ever signed. He classified it as an advance against Roy Anderson's inheritance." The word "advance" hung in the air. My mother didn't understand it immediately. I watched realization arrive in stages. Margaret simplified it. "The $1.2 million has already been counted. It is deducted from Roy's portion of the estate. There is no separate gift. And under the terms Harold signed 8 weeks ago, after that deduction, Roy Anderson receives this amount." She turned the page around. The number was small, smaller than the truck Dale could barely afford. Then Margaret looked up and read a sentence directly from my grandfather's instructions. A sentence he specifically requested be read aloud. "A cleared check is not the same as a kept promise." The room fell silent. My mother's own words had come back to meet her. "We took care of him." The check cleared. For 8 months, that had been her defense. Now one sentence erased it. She had treated the transfer like a receipt. My grandfather had treated it like a test, and according to him, the test had failed. Then Margaret continued. "The remainder of the estate, after the advance to Roy and several modest bequests, including a charitable fund directed by Harold Anderson, passes in trust to his granddaughter, Faye Anderson." She stated the amount. I barely heard it. My hand was gripping the edge of the table. The brass key was still warm in my palm. Margaret then picked up the cream-colored envelope I had found 11 days earlier and never opened. He asked me to read this at the end, she said. To all of you. She unfolded the letter. It was short. Harold had never wasted words. To the ones who received the check. I hope it spends well. I gave it to you intentionally. I wanted to see what a person does when he believes the money already belongs to him, and the old man has become a burden. Now I know. Margaret paused and continued. To Faye, you didn't open the envelope. I watched you put it back. You never once asked what was in it for you. Not even on the worst night. That is the only measure of character I have ever trusted. The land was never just dirt, kid. Neither were you. Take care of it the way you took care of me. I didn't cry. I had already promised myself I wouldn't. And I kept that promise. Instead, I placed my hand flat on the accordion file, on the word land written in his pencil handwriting, and I left it there. That was when my mother exploded. She manipulated him. She pushed up from her chair. A sick old man, confused. 8 weeks before he died, she got into his head. She turned him against us. This is undue influence, and I will challenge every word. Margaret didn't even blink. The video recording of Harold's competency evaluation is included in the file, she said. 2 physicians assessed him and found him fully competent. You are welcome to contest it. My mother turned toward me. After everything I sacrificed for this family. 30 years. And you steal it from us with a soldering iron and a sob story. Her face was wet now. But it wasn't grief. It was anger dressed up as grief. And for the first time, everyone in the room could see the difference. Dale sat with his head in his hands, calculating money that was never coming. Carol had gone completely still. She looked at my mother as though she were seeing her clearly for the first time in 3 decades. And my father made a small broken sound. He was staring at the letter. His eyes were red. His mouth moved. Then a single word came out, Dad, just that. For a moment, I thought he might finally speak honestly, finally acknowledge what had happened, finally choose differently. He looked at me, I looked back. Then my mother snapped his name, Roy. Sharp, immediate, and he lowered his eyes back to the carpet, back to where he had spent 30 years. Take care of me. My grandfather had asked for one thing, one promise, and it had not been made to the person holding the money. I stood, not because I had a speech prepared. I didn't. I stood because I was finished sitting there, and because I wanted to remain the calmest person in the room. My mother continued talking. Lawyers, appeals, threats, arguments. I waited until she ran out of momentum. Then I spoke. I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to call relatives, make posts, or start campaigns. Grandpa already said everything that needed to be said. I'm simply going to do what he asked. She stared at me, waiting for an attack, waiting for something she could use. I didn't give her one. You had a contract you never signed, I said. I had a man I never sent back. That's the difference. The only difference there ever was. I picked up the accordion file and the brass key. Margaret nodded toward the door. I nodded back. Then I stopped. There was one final thing that needed to be said, and it cost me nothing. He washed his own mug the night he died. I looked mostly at my father. So you wouldn't have to. Then I walked out. Behind me, my mother's voice rose again, but this time it hit something different. Silence. The silence of people who no longer believed her. I kept walking, past the smell of toner, past the waiting room, and out into the rain. What happened afterward is important because consequences matter more than satisfaction. My parents kept the $1.2 million. Much of it had already been spent. A new Buick, a kitchen renovation, part of Dale's failed investment project. But because it was treated as an advance, nothing else was coming. The $20 million they assumed would eventually become theirs never belonged to them. They chose not to contest the will. Margaret quietly referenced the competency evaluations and physician reports. Any potential fight ended before it began. Dale was forced to face his debts without a rescue payment. The last I heard, he was selling his truck. The cousins who had repeated my mother's version of events became very quiet. A month later, Aunt Carol called me. The first thing she said was, "I'm sorry, Faye," and I believed her. It was easier that way. The version of my mother that had controlled the family for 30 years, devoted, deprived, heartbroken, didn't survive that conference room. Too many people had watched her stand over her father's final words and call her daughter a thief, Some things cannot be repaired with tears and carefully chosen outfits. She once said, standing on that porch in the rain, "He's not our problem anymore." In the end, she was right, just not in the way she intended. None of them were my problem anymore. I was the one holding the file labeled the land, the brass key, and a letter I will keep for the rest of my life. I wish I could say I felt victorious. I didn't. I drove home through the storm while Grandpa's weather radio announced that conditions were clearing. I sat in the parking lot until the rain stopped, and I felt the strange sadness of winning something I would have traded away instantly for one more cup of bad coffee with a stubborn old rancher. It's been a year. I did what he asked. The trust funded the project we began together at my kitchen table. A low-cost soil and weather sensor built around his beloved weather radio, a tool that reads public weather band information so farmers don't have to pay expensive subscription fees just to know what the sky is doing. We sell it now at a price ordinary farms can afford. That was always his point. Good tools earn their keep. I also manage the fund he created in the will. It's small, focused, practical. It helps families afford home care for aging parents instead of leaving them alone when money becomes difficult. We call it the Herald Fund. No plaques, no galas, just rent assistance, prescription coverage, and support for people whose families decided they were a burden. His radio still sits on my workbench, still playing forecasts, still talking to a room that usually ignores it. The chipped blue mug holds my pens. The brass key hangs on a nail near the door. Some mornings, I touch it on my way out, the same way he used to turn it in his fingers. The key really did open something worth opening. A drawer, a truth, a future. But most importantly, it opened the part of me that had stopped believing that showing up for people mattered. A check can clear in a second. People will tell you that settles everything. But keeping a promise takes a lifetime. And in the end, that is the only account anyone remembers when the room finally goes quiet. That's my story. One storm, one promise, take care of me, and a will that finally answered it. If this story reminded you that love is measured by actions, not wire transfers, take it as a sign. Call the person who once showed up for you while you still can. And if someone else needs to hear this message, share it with them. Leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.